Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today for Cafe Jesus, Daily Word. I was wondering if we get to you before church, but we did. So it's 93 degrees outside in Phoenix. Is that hot for April? Yeah, I think it is. And it's the 9th day of April, Saturday. And today, well, let's see how many of you guys out there remember. Remember when Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, came up and he would tell his opponents what round he would knock them out in and defeat them? And remember the Thriller in Manila with Joe Frazier? And remember In the Jungle with George Foreman? And then the days of Mike Tyson? Well, today we're going to be looking at the fight of all time, the fight of the Millineum. A imposing Goliath who stood between 9 and 12 feet tall against a young shepherd boy, David, who would eventually be king of Israel. Now, without further ado, let's get to today's reading, 1 Samuel 17.
Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah, in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered, and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shema. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning, and left the sheep with a keeper, and took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines, and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the man who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine, and takes away the reproach from Israel?" For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, So shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now Eliab his eldest brother heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another, and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head, and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite.
And that is the end of the word of the Lord for the huge, mighty chapter of 1 Samuel 17. Now, some observations. Did you catch in like the very beginning verses that the Philistines were already gathered in a land that was belonged to Judah? They were already invaded. They already stole and wanted to steal the land. And so Saul and his armies did gather, but they didn't know that a fighter such as Goliath, was to come out and see them. Well, Goliath was so imposing, he was like the professional Terminator. And he says, why have you even come out? Choose a man among yourselves, because you have no representative like me. And if I beat you, you'll be our slaves, just like Egypt. But if you win, we'll serve you. Word to the wise, never trust the devil at his word. And he spoke defiantly. He says, I defy the ranks of Israel. And Saul and the army was very afraid when they heard these things. Well, why? Maybe you didn't know that even though Saul was a mighty warrior, one, he didn't have the Spirit of God with him anymore, and he was a very old man. He was advanced in years. And for 40 days, Goliath would go out and taunt them. Now, doesn't this sound like Jesus in the wilderness, how the devil wanted to taunt the human Jesus and lauded over him and get him to bend down? Jesus wouldn't bend, neither would King David, later King David. But he wasn't recognized as a king right away. Even his father sent him out, hey, errand boy, go take your brother some lunch and tell the army of Israel we're rooting for him. Before he did, though, he didn't neglect his responsibilities. A good shepherd boy. He had a keeper look after them. And, before Saul would even consider him, really, David had to plead about his resume, about how he killed lions and bears. And so, if we look at Goliath, even in the days of Joshua, these guys were known as the Anakim. Did you know that Joshua met Anakim Skywalker in the Bible 400 years before there? Well, might not have been Anakim Skywalker, but he did represent Darth Vader for sure. And this is what caused the initial Israelites not to cross over into the promised land. They were afraid, for they were giants, and these were like grasshoppers. So they were intimidated. But Goliath was their chosen one. Now, a cubit, by some measures, were 18 inches to 24 inches. So if he was 6 cubits, he'd be at least 9 feet tall, maybe as tall as 12 feet. And his armor weighed at least almost 150 to 200 pounds, just his armor. Most men don't weigh that. And so, of course, Saul was afraid. Why? Because he was the one who stood head and shoulders above all the army of Israel. And so it would likely be him going up against Goliath, and he wasn't about to. And really, the 40 days of taunting, well, guess what? Just to show you're a coward. You don't want to stand up. So although he was tall, he was not that tall. Although he was strong, he was not that strong. And now he wasn't even young anymore. He was fighting very old, but most of all, he had lost the Spirit of the Lord. Now, does the devil ever go up against you in a fair fight? No, it was already 2 against 1. It's against little David. And he had Goliath and his armor bearer. Now, many of you don't know the legend of Goliath. He had 4 brothers. So that maybe this is perhaps why David took 5 smooth stones. David wasn't off the hook that easy. Because if you notice this in, verse 46, that not only when he defeats Goliath, He said, I will give the dead bodies, not body, not singular, of the Philistines' army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Well, so that really is part of the fight that's not really discussed. He fought more than one. Now, David was the youngest of 8 brothers. He kind of spent his time, if you remember in chapter 16, he would bring his harp and calm down the evil spirits of Saul in 1 Samuel 16, last chapter. So he spent his time partly in the palace and partly taking care of the shepherd as a shepherd boy in his father's fields. Now, it seems that David was only called to the palace as needed, so perhaps Saul had forgotten about him. And David was told as an errand boy, go bring something to your brothers, and thinking that, oh, perhaps they would be happy to see him. Not so quickly. And when David left, of course, he had the keeper take care of the sheep, so it showed that he had the heart of a shepherd. He cared. And then David sees Goliath's challenge and the fear in the eyes of the Israel soldiers. And there was not a man who would take on Goliath. Every one of them fled. They were all cowards. And so he heard about the reward, but David really didn't care about the reward. He cared about God's honor. And David alone focused on the reputation of the living God. When he said, this man, the uncircumcised Philistine, not even calling Goliath by his name or recognizing his title, and the Terminator. When the men of Israel said, surely he has come up to defy Israel, David said, this one has come to defy the armies of the living God. Kind of like, what a fool he is. And so when the men said the man who kills him, the man who kills this Philistine takes, David says, takes away the reproach, the shame of Israel for not standing up. So David saw things from the Lord's perspective, but the men of Israel only saw things from the reward, like the king's daughter, the tax exemption, whatever riches they could get from. Because really, if Goliath had beaten them, it's all over. They're slaves again, and Israel either submits or they all die. And so David, again, is misunderstood by his jealous brothers. Sounds almost like Joseph and his brothers, saying Eliab. Eli stands for priest. Apparently, he didn't even respect Samuel when he visited, the oldest, being jealous, perhaps, that knowing that David would be king. He was the one that was anointed. None of the other 7 were anointed. And they never gave David credit. He felt David was an insignificant, worthless kid who had no right to speak up with bold words. And it's like, oh yeah, you're going to back this up. And he felt that David's motivation was really for the spoils, but he didn't know David's heart. And he was also angry because he's perhaps provoking one who could fight, but didn't. Maybe even himself, since he was kind of tall and strong. So he was dreadfully afraid, and last thing you want to tell somebody to do when they're afraid is to be courageous. So David says, what have I done? You have no cause to be against me. David stuck to his position and says, there is no doubt that the words that Eliab said hurt him, but he would not let it hinder him. He would not take it to heart. He didn't care like Saul cared about the opinion of the people. David was concerned with God's cause before everything, before his own personal safety, his own personal glory, his own personal honor. He had a passionate concern for doing the will of God. This is why David was a man after God's own heart, and Saul was not. David's confident words were made known to Saul. Now, he didn't go out there and say, oh, if I fight against that Philistine, I'm going to whip his tail. He's nothing. David didn't talk like that. He stood up, not in his own strength, but in the strength of the Lord. He stood up to Goliath. He showed courage more than anyone in Israel. And Saul says, oh, great. After 40 days, I've got this little shepherd boy that wants to go up against this giant. But David's training as a shepherd boy prepared him. In fact, he presents his resume to Saul, as we said. He, by the tell of the tape, he was going to get the first punch. He was done, right? On the carnal and the fleshy outward look of man, this guy doesn't stand a chance. In fact, the champ might not have to throw a punch. He just might look at him and he might fall down and wet his pants. But even if and Saul says, even if the battle was on a level playing ground, this guy has more experience than before you were born, David. Well, David said someone should fight Goliath for a righteous cause, and he said he would. Now, he says he'll kill Goliath. Now, these guys are thinking, well, nobody else can do it. Why not? And then if we lose, I guess we submit to the Philistines. Now, that was pretty much the scenario. And David can look back and know that God delivered him out of the hands of the lions and the bears and tigers before. So he had a faith in God that he would be delivered here. And so David prepares for the fight. Of course, the king, Saul, he says, put this armor on. And of course, Saul's much taller and much bigger. It didn't fit. It was too big, and it was Saul's armor. You can't fight in somebody else's strength. And so, spiritually, it didn't fit David at all. So, defying the king, he reminded him what it was like to walk in the Spirit of God. So, why did David choose the 5 stones? Again, we talked about Goliath having 4 relatives. And, of course, the devil never keeps his word, does he? So, David not only had the talk, he walked the walk. He didn't renounce, and he actually drew near to the Philistine. That was real faith. Now, Goliath, all the meantime, is cursing God and David, and it was the two. Remember, the armor bearer was with him, so it was 2 for 1. But what Goliath said, "Am I a dog?" Most people miss that. The translation here in the Hebrew is kaleb, and it is used in passages of Deuteronomy 23:18. But basically what Goliath was saying is, am I effeminate that you send this fairy boy out against me? You insult my manhood. So he's saying, you're calling me queer? Verse 45 through 47, David was full of faith and replied to Goliath. It says, you come to me the best you know how, Goliath, but today I'm going to introduce you to your maker. And this whole incident does make David famous, but that's not why he did it. He did it for the fame and glory of God in Israel, not his own name. He wanted the whole earth to know that there was a God in Israel. And so round 1, David kills Goliath. Goliath is enraged at David's boldness. How dare you draw near to me? I'll make quick work of you. And he drew near to quickly kill David. He didn't want to prolong this. It was embarrassing already. David didn't run away. David didn't hide. He didn't panic. He didn't drop to his knees and pray in his corner. Instead, David hastened and ran to meet the Philistine. Just as the Philistine god Dagon fell on his face in the challenge at the temple, guess what? So now the worshiper of Dagon falls on his face. So David beheads Goliath, and Israel romps over the Philistines. Remember, they agreed to surrender to Israel if their champion lost in verse 9? Well, should never expect the devil to live up to his promises. He never does. He's a liar. He's been a liar since the beginning. So the soldiers of Israel pursued and defeated the Philistines, and David's example gave them great courage and faith. It was what I would call contagious evangelism. Saul meets the victorious David and doesn't even recognize him, even though in the last chapter he was there, the one that was soothing him with tunes. And perhaps maybe there was a screen between him and the king, so maybe he never did see him. But it seems weird to me that although David had the security pass to be in the White House of Israel, that Saul wouldn't recognize him. So perhaps Saul asked this question because of his family's background. Maybe he didn't know him that well, and he wanted to know, what man now is going to marry my daughter? Because I did promise, if somebody took out Goliath, well, you got my daughter, you're tax-free, and this is going to be my future son-in-law. Now, it's possible that David's appearance changed from time to time when he didn't see Saul, and he didn't immediately recognize him, and Saul even called him a young man, which means he was fully grown, mature, and ready to marry. Sometimes we don't read our Bible close enough, we don't catch these things, but fortunately, we can take the time when we need to. Well, thanks for staying with me. It was a very long word today, but a good word, and I hope it blessed you. May the Lord bless you and keep you this weekend. May you serve him in full capacity at your church and in your neighborhood. May you share Jesus at all times. Have a great day. We'll see you again tomorrow if the Lord tarries, and if not, we'll be looking for you on the other end. God bless. Have a great day.